Hola, buenos días a todos los asistentes. Quiero recordarles que este webinar cuenta con traducción simultánea al español. En la parte de abajo de sus pantallas pueden ver un globo terráqueo. Haciendo clic sobre él pueden elegir ya sea el idioma español o si lo prefieren pueden escuchar el seminario en inglés, que es el idioma original en que se llevará a cabo. Dejo con ustedes a Guillermo Artur, presidente de la Federación Internacional de AFPs, quien dará unas breves palabras de bienvenida.
Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to the third webinar seminar of FIAP. Good morning and good afternoon for those that are joining us from Europe. Today, we have the pleasure to have the participation of Charles Millard and Derek Dobson under the moderation of the economist Carol Fernandez. Charles is Senior Advisor of Amundi Pioneer. He is the former director of the United States Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. From 2011 to 2016, he was managing director of Head of Pension Relations with Citigroup. He has served as senior advisor of multiple firms, and he is also on the board of directors of Ross Corporate Service in the United Kingdom. He constantly writes and speaks on pension and retirement issues. Derek is CEO of and plan managers of the College of Applied Arts and Technology Pension Plan of Canada, in addition to leading one of Canada model pension plans. He plays an active role in various industry groups, notably as co-chair in the Canadian Public Pension Leadership Council, as a member of the board of directors of the Association of Canadian Pension Management, and a founding faculty member of the Master of Trust Managing Standards of the International Foundation of Employee Benefits and Pension. Today, they will share with us some insights about the US and Canadian pension system, and we hope to extract some lessons for their experience to be applied in Latin America. The private pension system in our region are constantly under political threat. In Chile, it has been recently approved a withdrawal of the 10% of individual pension account with a minimum of retirement of about $1,300 and a maximum approx of $3,000 to overcome the financial distress that families are facing due to COVID crisis. Those who have less than 1,300, the minimum, in their individual accounts will be able to withdraw their funds completely. The new approved law does not include any mechanism to return the withdrawn funds. This measure will, in practice, let about 3 million Chilean workers without any saving for their retirement. Also, of course, this law will have a negative impact on the level of pension that to be received for the retirees. It is very contradictory that this law was approved at the same time, at the same moment in which the Congress is discussing a bill to increase the rate of contribution from 10 to 16% of the salary in order to improve the level of pensions. Additionally, there are political voices that claim for the return to the old and fiscal and sustainable pay-as-you-go system, with the hope that this will improve workers' pension, which is far from being reality. and will worsen the sustainability of the system as a whole. The idea of returning to pay-as-you-go system has been held despite the fact that this system has failed in all the world, that all those countries which have still this kind of system are gradually adopting some mechanisms to strengthen the individual accounts. In Peru, the private pension system is being constantly dismantled, deviating pension savings to other objectives besides pension. In 2017, as a populist measure, workers were allowed to retire up to 95.5% of their funds. Evidence shows that most of these funds has been already spent. Recently, it has also approved the retirement of 25% of the pension fund to overcome COVID crisis. This is how different initiatives are taking place in Latin American region that respond to ideological bias of certain political groups rather than to the true technical consensus regarding what should be done to improve pensions and properly diversify the sources of retirement income. Measures in the right direction must include increasing the weight of defined contribution individually funded pension system in order to complement the weak public pay-as-you-go system, increasing the contribution rates to the individual funded pension programs in order to increase total saving and finance better old age pensions, and focus the state efforts on subsidizing the contribution of the most vulnerable workers. As an example of this kind of measure is the recent pension reform that the Mexican government proposed just a few days ago, which proposed gradually increasing the overall contribution rate to the individually funded program from 6.5% to 15% to the salary over a period of 8 years. At the same time, in the proposal reform, the government will concentrate its efforts on improving the situation of those workers that have not been able to save a sufficient amount to obtain an adequate pension. In Europe, we have many examples of countries that have still a pay-as-you-go system, but despite that, they are transforming step by step in personal individual account, like the case of Netherlands now. I hope this conference can help enlighten our debate, our political debate, despite the fact that the law which were recently passed, both in Chile and in Peru, were against the expert opinion and warning. Without any further delay, I will give the screen to the speaker, and first of all, to Carol Fernandez. Thank you very much, and welcome to our seminar.
Muy buenos días. Una vez más, quiero recordar a nuestros asistentes que en la parte inferior de sus pantallas tienen la opción de escuchar el webinar en español, si así lo prefieren, haciendo clic en la opción que dice interpretación. Once again, I want to thank Charles and Derek for sharing with us some aspects of the Canadian and the U.S. pension systems in order to extract some lessons for Latin American countries. Previous FIAP webinar was about how private pension systems in Europe are in the rescue of public and traditionally pay-as-you-go programs. So I would like to start asking Charles if the same is happening in the US. I mean, if private pension programs is in the rescue of the Social Security pension plan in the U.S.
Gracias, Carol. Es un placer estar con todos ustedes y para estar un huésped de FIAP. Que es una lástima que no podría hacer todo este webinar en español. Voy a hablar en inglés, pero estoy muy feliz de estar con todos ustedes. Thank you for your question, Carol. In the U.S., the Social Security system is essentially a modified pay-as-you-go. People do put money in, but they get back far more from the tax base over time than they put in. So that's one part of the U.S. system. There's really four parts. Another part is the classic defined benefit pension plan, which now exists mostly in the public sector, mostly government employees. There are some corporations that still have defined benefit plans, but not so many. So that would be the third, is that there are some private sector defined benefit pension plans. And then the fourth piece of the American system is the defined contribution system, generally known as 401k. And the question about pay-go and private sector pensions, I believe, is especially directed at the distinction between Social Security and the 401k system. Social Security today replaces about 40% of a lower worker's income, pays about $18,000. It can pay as much as $36,000, but for a lower income worker, the pay is about $18,000. That's poverty level for two people. So clearly there's a need for, if not a rescue, a stronger 401k system that can, to use Guillermo's word, can complement the Social Security system, especially at the lower levels of income.
Yes, well, indeed, I have recently read some news that indicates that by 2035, most of the reserves of the Social Security in the U.S. Will be gone. So I will want that you tell to us which will be the consequences for the public expenditure when that happens, and how the government will be able to maintain the long-term financial sustainability of the Social Security.
Right. Well, first, it has become a commonplace statement for people to say, young people today know that Social Security won't exist when they retire. I don't think that's true. I think Social Security will exist, and I think that some way, even if it's purely pay-as-you-go, the United States will continue to provide a level of Social Security to essentially everyone. Keep in mind that when Social Security was created, it was meant to keep senior citizens from poverty. So if you say, well, the goal is to keep people out of poverty, at least Social Security does that, and I think will continue to. But I'm jumping the gun a little bit. There are 50 million families, working families in the United States, that have no retirement plan from work at all. So clearly we need more either defined contribution plans like 401ks. I've always advocated that private sector businesses could put together more defined benefit plans that would be a little bit more like the one that Derek runs, where people would share risk and have a better chance for better outcomes. But in the immediate term, Social Security is weak, and it needs the additional pillar of more 401k private sector plans, yes.
Yes, thank you, Charles. I would like to ping-pong the question to Derek. And I want that you referred what is happening in Canada. But first, could you please explain to us a little bit how the Canadian system is composed, and also refer, as Charles did, about the fiscal position of the public pillar, and how important is private pillar in Canadian overall pension composition?
Thank you, Carol, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. For you to get the most out of this session in a short amount of time, I'm going to be very opinionated. In truth, there are many subtleties and nuances, but the time doesn't permit these today, but I'm happy to have follow-up conversations with anybody on this webinar. So the Canadian pension has three main parts. The design itself of those three parts work well, but improvements could be made. So part number one is the tax-funded part. So there's no pre-funding, a true pay-as-you-go system. This is our old age security and our guaranteed income supplement programs. These programs are designed to mitigate pensioner poverty, very, very basic income. Because they're paid at a tax revenue, they're means tested, and each governing party can sort of set the rules of the program, like changing the retirement age. Right now, these programs cost about 3% of GDP. This public pillar in that context is sustainable in its current form, but it's highly dependent on demographics. Some tweaks have been made between political parties, but for the most part, it's been a stable model. Pension system number two in Canada is employment-based pensions. This is the most important part of the pension system in Canada. If the goal is to have a reasonable standard of living, which is what 97% of Canadians want. So in Canada, the typical retirement period is about 25 years. This is a long time if you get this wrong. So that's why this pillar is so important. So there's three subcomponents of the workplace pension system. The first one is mandatory. So each workplace, the members and the employers must contribute to the Canada Pension Plan. It's a modified pay-as-you-go system. So it's not fully funded, but it's got quite a large reserve fund meant to stabilize contributions so that there's equity across generations. It's very sustainable. The actuarial reports look out 75 years into the future to create stable contributions and stable benefits. This happened after 1990s when contributions were raised to about 5% employee and 5% employer. This is what made it sustainable. The target here is about 25% replacement income of the average wage. In Canadian dollars, roughly $55,000. In actual fact, however, a median pension delivers only about half of the target maximum, about 13% of pre-retirement wage. So the poverty that I talked about, pillar one before, maybe about 6 to 8%, this about 13%. So in total, about 20% for the average Canadian. Not enough other than to avoid poverty. So the second part of the workplace pillar is the most important, and it's the voluntary system. So employers are not obligated to do it, but many do, but not all do. So employers set up and run their either own defined benefit or own defined contribution plan. Most DB plans in Canada are very well funded based on our regulatory regime. However, in bankruptcy, we've seen some cuts, but not substantial ones. And finally, my type of plan is the largest system in Canada. It's the multi-employer system where employers or industries or unions set up their own plan across many employers. Canada's largest pension plans are these types of plans, and they cover the most members in the workplace system. This is what my plan does, the CAP plan, and it brings the best of DB and DC. Internationally, these types of plans in Canada are seen to be the best governed and best run and are very sustainable. Our funded ratio, for example, is 118%. And when we ask our members, 100% of them say we're a sustainable model, as do our employers. So that's very important. There are some challenges with some smaller plans. And finally, the pension system in Canada has a personal savings pillar. So individuals can contribute on a tax-preferred basis. This system is not working. It's underused and there's high fees. In fact, in Canada, the average and median account balance would provide less than 2 months of expenses in retirement. And again, 25 years is the expected retirement lifespan, and these individual savings pillars are only 2 months. So in summary, Canada has a 3-pillar system. It's designed to have all 3 pillars working together. Old age security avoids poverty. Workplace pension system is where all the innovation is occurring, but coverage is low. This is the issue. And finally, the do-it-yourself is not working well in Canada. So although Canada's system gets a lot of accolades because it's got a good regulatory framework, there's some innovation, There's high performance. Coverage is the number one issue we're facing.
Okay, I would like to go back to Charles because Derek mentioned some figures about replacement rates that are quite impressive. So I would like that Charles, if you have some numbers in mind about how is the overall composition of the replacement rate in the US. I mean, which proportion comes from the public pillar and which one from the private programs?
So on the somewhat depressing side, as I mentioned, Social Security, the minimum benefit that Social Security would pay, depending on how much you put in, is about $18,000 a year. As I said, that's enough to keep two people at the poverty level. Most of those people do not have a 401k or a defined contribution or a voluntary system. As I mentioned before, 50 million working Americans have no workplace pension plan. They don't have an IRA. They don't have a 401k. There is some legislation in the various states in the U.S. to begin requiring that employers at least set up a defined contribution system or participate in one that the states have set up. And the federal government is considering legislation to do the same nationwide, but currently that's not required. So you have the average 401k balance. Remember, the average is raised by those who have a lot. It's not the median, but the average for a 70-year-old is about $170,000, which sounds pretty good. And then you stop and realize, well, that's $7,000 a year. So the person who has $18,000 in Social Security, that's a 40% replacement on average, can get, if they have the average 401k balance, if they're lucky enough to have a 401k balance, then the average is about another $7,000 a year is what you could get from a $170,000 balance. So that's $25,000 a year. So clearly, there, as Derek said, people want a reasonable lifestyle or a reasonable level of income. I don't think that we are targeting $25,000 a year as a reasonable level of income for the cost of living in the United States. And that's why I've advocated for so many of the improvements to the system that would encourage more people to be in the system and to have more shared pooling of risks, which I know we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Yes, well, now that you mentioned 401k plans, I think that one important lesson that this kind of plans have is about the importance of automatic enrollment. So could you please tell us a little bit how is the overall experience about automatic enrollment in these programs?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I was trying to look up the Spanish word for nudge, because what automatic enrollment does is it nudges. The closest Spanish word would be empujar, to push. But if you can see my elbow, nudge is sort of a gentle empujar.
Yeah, like
and what really comes down to is how you frame the issue. When a person comes to your employment, you don't ask them, do you want? Well, similarly, if you say, here's the deal. When you begin working here, we take 3% or 5% or 6% or whatever the right number is, and we put it in the 401k. You can opt out. Obviously, you cannot opt out of paying taxes, but you can opt out of the 401k if you want to. But the way we start off, the default is automatic enrollment. And when people are automatically enrolled, 91% stay in. So auto enrollment has been a huge success. And there's another aspect of it that's important, which is at what level does the employer automatically enroll you? Is 3% really enough? And the good news is half of the people, of the companies that do auto enrollment now actually enroll people above the 3% minimum. Some of them are even 5 or 6%. There's a lot of movement to say that should gradually increase. So your automatic percentage taken out would grow as your own salary grows, which is another way of helping create more of the security for retirement that we're talking about.
And that sounds like very nice for countries like the US or Canada, where you have a high level of formal workers. But what can happen like in Latin America where we have like 60% informality? So how can we, do you think that we can push all these huge amount of workers to contribute for pensions in some voluntary way?
Well, it's interesting you asked that because, you know, one of the key components for a healthy retirement system is adequacy and sustainability. So if sustainability means you can't take out more than you put in, then Chile's system, for example, is very sustainable. But is it adequate? And of course, it's not adequate because so many people do not put in either anything or the required amount, or they're not in, as you say, I think it's 50%, I thought it was 50% in Chile anyway, of the workforce is either sometimes or frequently in the informal sector. You know, if people are not required to put into pension savings, it's difficult then to provide pension savings for them. Obviously, Social Security and pay-as-you-go systems that are designed to alleviate poverty are specifically designed for the kinds of people that you're talking about. But I think that if you're going to have a healthy pension system, you've got to find ways to micro-enroll people. And in Indonesia and Nigeria, there are some efforts underway to try to get people, even in the informal economy, enrolled in defined contribution pensions.
Yes. I would like to go back to Derek, who mentioned something about modern defined benefit pension plans. I would like that you explain to us which is the main difference with the traditional, like European defined benefit plans.
Absolutely, and this is where all the innovation is happening in Canada. And so modern defined benefit is a term that we use, and it really points to large pooled groups, multi-employer, long-term focused, joint governance. This is sort of the definition of modern DB, but what's more important and why it's being taken up so much in Canada, and I think that'll continue to grow tremendously, is really removing the pain points with the current traditional defined benefit or defined contribution, depending on which stakeholder lens you have. So the number one reason when, for the last 15 years, when you survey chief financial officers in Canada about what's your intention around pensions, it's always, we're going to close it and defined benefit. And the reason why is accounting volatility. So employers stopped endorsing or providing good workplace pensions, and in my term that is predominantly a defined benefit, and I'll get to that in a moment, because of accounting volatility or because of solvency issues or impacts on the balance sheet, etc. Those weren't the promises that were made when the plans were set up. Systems changed, regulatory regimes changed midway, and because of laws in Canada, this made it very painful. So modern DB takes away the accounting risk, takes away the volatility. Employers have fixed contributions in our plan. They cannot go up even if the plan is in deficit. So this is a key feature of modern DB and why CAD is being so successful. So that's on the employer perspective. We take the best of defined contribution, fixed contributions, nothing on the balance sheet, and we provide that to the employer. And we take care of governance and administration, so it's very simple. On the member side, clearly the biggest risk is managing longevity, timing risk, investment volatility, etc. So we've taken that, and they get a pure defined benefit plan with an upside. So if the plan is doing well, we give enhancements to members because we are a trust fund. And if a plan's doing well, not doing well, you still get your core defined benefit plan. So essentially modern DB is the best of defined benefit and the best of defined contribution when you look at it from the stakeholder lens of the employer and the member.
Thank you, Derek. Somebody from the public is asking to Derek that you mentioned before that the pension system is prepared for the following 25 years in Canada. So this person is asking what is going to happen after this 25 years window.
Yeah, so there's two things there. So the average lifespan in retirement is 25 years, and I think that's why defined benefit was a big pillar of the Canadian system. And I might have misspoke. I meant to say 75 years. So the Canada Pension Plan, basically they do a report every 5 years, which looks out the next 75 years and says, can we provide the current level of benefits at the current contribution rate? And right now, the past 6 reports have all confirmed that the plan is sustainable. So, because Charles had mentioned a lot of people didn't believe that Social Security will be around. And this is exactly what happened in the Netherlands. People lost faith, and we have intergenerational conflicts, even though they had a very sustainable and robust system. So in Canada, in the 1990s, they changed the method and said, okay, we're going to have this 75-year outlook. And what happens is every 5 years, they just add another 5 years on the end of the 75 years. So it gets retested every 5 years. So there's no cliff that at the end of that period, something bad's going to happen. We always do a projection 75 years into the future.
So that's great. I would like now to move the conversation to some investment issues that some people here is very concerned about. And one key difference between investment regulation in Canada and the US with Latin American countries is that you apply what you call prudent person principle. While in Latin America, you are used to use a very restrictive quantitative limits on asset allocation, etc. So could you please, you both, refer to us which are the advantages of using this approach instead of traditional quantitative investment limits? And how does it operate in practice? Because it sounds like, okay, you go ahead and do whatever you think is prudent. So how does it operate in practice? And which is the role of the regulation authority under this regulation approach? Maybe Charles can start, please.
So first of all, the law that regulates American pensions is called ERISA. It stands for the Employee Retirement Investment Security Act. And it makes certain requirements about how defined benefit plans are run and how defined contribution plans are run. And one of the famous provisions of that law is the prudent person standard. And it's interesting because often when you hear the prudent person rule, you think, oh, you need to be careful. And of course, a prudent person does need to be careful. But a prudent person who's trying to provide for the 25 years of retirement that Derek just spoke about is going to be careful in a different way, is going to understand risk and reward in a different way than simply being careful. And so the standard in ERISA is that you shall take the care, skill, prudence, and diligence that a prudent person in similar situation would take. I've always found that to be language that pretty much anybody could argue just about anything, but there is a lot of case law and there's a lot of regulation that explains what a prudent person does. One thing is the investments must be solely focused on financial outcomes, and they must be exclusively for the benefit of the recipients themselves. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, there's tremendous amount of law and regulation about proper diversification. So although you can hold company stock in your 401k, you can't hold, I believe it's 10%. You can't hold more than 10% of your 401k in company stock. You could go out and buy some if you wanted to on your own, but the company can't be putting more than 10% in. And diversification is one of the key elements to proper prudent person standards. Interestingly, in recent months, and I wrote an op-ed on this about a year ago, an opinion column, saying that 401ks should be permitted to invest more in alternative assets, in particular private equity, hedge funds, and real estate. Not that I want individuals to go off and buy the latest private equity, but I'm sure we'll talk about target date funds in a moment. Target date funds are more institutionally managed on behalf of the individual recipient of the 401k. And they certainly should be able to gain the benefits that a prudent person would gain from utilizing the diversification aspects that come from proper use
limited use, but proper use of private equity or hedge funds or real estate.
Derek?
Sure. And in Canada, we talk more in the broader terms of fiduciary duty, which is very, very similar to the prudent person rule, which means that we have to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries. And I agree completely with Charles, is that safe, so 100% bond index is made appear safe because there's low volatility, but that's not acting in the best interests of the beneficiaries. So in Canada, fiduciary duty is much more in the longer term outcomes of the plan and the membership itself. Canada did start in a very restrictive space from an investment perspective, and then over a period of decades, it basically became unrestricted in terms of being able to invest worldwide and essentially in any asset class. Case in point, the CAD investment strategy has 35% in private markets, so real estate, infrastructure, and private equity. We have commodities. We have hedge fund strategies. Absolute return strategies. We have a lot in that, which 30 years ago simply would have been bond and equity, Canadian bond and equity type portfolio. So fiduciary duty has been very consistent with pushing a longer view. So time horizon is the second main point I want to make here, is that it shouldn't be in the 1 year measurement period of your annual report or your message out to stakeholders. However you're communicating, you have to be able to have good policies in place and good communication programs in place to explain that short-term volatility is part of the ride to get to those long-term outcomes. So for me, prudent person also includes a very strong communication program and a very strong governance structure so that you have alignment there. So I think those are the main things, and proof is in the pudding here. So for example, my plan in the CIBC Bank of New York Mellon universe, which is Canada's largest custodian, there's 3, and we are the #1 plan out of 39 plans over $1 billion in terms of 5 and 10 year net returns. And that is because we are focused on the long term, and we've done the communication to know that we're going to have short-term volatility. For example, in the global financial crisis, we went down more than most of our peer plans. But coming out of the global financial crisis, we've done much better than some of the largest plans in Canada. So fiduciary duty, prudent person rule, focused on the long term, and a strong communication and governance program, all, to me, all come together.
Carol, can I add something there?
Yes, sure.
It's interesting, prudent person and fiduciary are almost the very same thing. It's an interesting question. So if I'm a fiduciary, one of the ways a fiduciary thinks about things is, what would I do if this was an investment that was for myself? So which of us on this webinar would suggest that saving only 3% a year is a good idea or a good place to start? So if we would never do that for just ourselves, then why are we doing that for the people for whom we are fiduciaries?
Yes, that's true.
Sorry, Carol, for just jumping in here. So when we opened up our plan to every workplace in Canada a couple of years ago, some of our peer plans were offering 3% contribution levels because that's what the not-for-profit sector could afford at that time. But to your point, Charles, our board took a different view. We wanted coverage and adequacy, which is what you mentioned before. So we allow employers and members to choose between, but the minimum, bare minimum is 5% each side, so 10% total, up to the tax limit of 18% in our plan. So fiduciary duty, I think, does extend to the desired outcomes, not necessarily from an investment context, but in terms of the best interest of the members. Because what we've seen in the survey data in Canada is that people don't know what their plan delivers, and they feel secure about their retirement, even if they're in a 1-in-1 plan or a 2-in-2 plan. So I think fiduciary duty does extend to plan design as well.
Thank you, Charles and Derek. Let's talk a little bit ESG investments. Some person from the public is asking about the recently announced change of rules in the ERISA plans that will limit the ESG focused investments. What's your opinion, Charles, about this change in the regulation?
Well, it's an interesting and very important question. The regulations from both parties, and people on this call know that Democrats are more to the left and Republicans are more to the right. And so from administration to administration, the regulatory rules around things like ESG a bit. So the prior administration essentially said, the question at hand is not, what do I think is a good idea? It is, what does the law allow? And if Congress wants to change the law and say, from now on, we're going to allow pensions to invest for social outcomes, that's fine. But the law is quite clear at the moment that it must be for the solely for the financial benefit of the beneficiary.
And Derek, is there some limitation?
The prior administration said you can take ESG factors into account. Become if there's a tie, if there's two different investments and they're tied,
I'm sorry, I think we have a problem with Charles' connection. Derek, do you listen to him?
I can't hear him either, but you're coming in loud and clear.
In the likely economic outcome of wherever you're investing your money. But the recent rule essentially says two things. It says, number one, you have to document that you really found a tie. And you have to show how you concluded there was a tie. And then you have to document how you concluded that these ESG factors actually will be met. Because the second piece of this regulatory issue in the US is people say, oh, it's ESG this, it's climate change that, it's diversity that. Well, the SEC, not the Department of Labor, but the Securities and Exchange Commission, has made it quite clear that they want people who promote their funds as being ESG funds to be able to demonstrate that they're meeting some specific standards.
Thank you, Charles. I think, Charles, you are having a little bit of problems with your internet connection, but we are listening to you well now. I have just get a question from my former professor, Eduardo Walker. So I have to do this question right now. He's asking to Derek, how does the system, the CPPIB, avoid political interference in investment decisions and also in the distribution of benefits among different groups with different abilities to influence the political system?
Yes, I think it started with the beginning of CPPIB, and the people who they hired were adamant that it had to be at arm's length from the government. And also CPPIB was meant to develop a reserve fund for future benefits rather than paying current benefits, because CPP at the time had government bonds there. So there was a bit of a run-out period, and this was a bit of a build-out. So I think that helped lessen any perceived way of political interference, and they've stayed mainly independent of that from an outsider spot looking in. Clearly, where all big pension plans in Canada face a little bit of pressure on Canadian infrastructure and real estate and investing in the local economy. But I would say that those are more facilitating those things rather than political interference. So, I mean, politics and pensions is connected everywhere, but I'd say in Canada it's less connected than in most places in the world. And that's why I think the Canadian system is working so well, is because most politicians and individuals, we have a shorter term focus and are influenced more by opinion polls, where the pension issue, the retirement savings issue, the pensioner poverty issue are long-term demographic and investment problems and solutions. So again, CPPIB, I think, started off with the right people who demanded independence as a condition of them joining, and have been able to maintain that. And that's on the investment side. And the question I had a little bit on the benefit side, CPPIB does not determine the benefits. That is the federal government working with the provinces on the benefit side. So that's really two separate groups, one on the investment side, CPPIB, and one on the benefit design side. And there, it's harder to change the benefit structure than it is to change the Canadian Constitution. You need more provinces, more percent of the population to make changes to the Canadian pension plan than you do to change our Constitution. So there's a lot of safeguards built in that you need a lot of people on side to make those changes.
Okay, thank you, Derek. Charles, you're back.
Yes.
Now in the last minutes we have for this conversation, I would like to move to the trending topic of the last months, the COVID crisis. And I would like to ask you, how do you think the asset allocation of pension funds is going to change after the COVID crisis, and how can pension programs can be prepared for future crises like this?
I think the biggest issue, and Derek certainly will have more to say here as well, that pensions ran into in a very, very compressed time frame was liquidity. And so defined benefit pension plans anyway, I think will seek greater areas of liquidity to be able to deal with potential emergencies. I don't actually think that the 401k world in the US is going to change that much. Because the Department of Labor has made it clear that yes, target date funds, which have a glide path, we didn't talk about them yet, but you have maybe 80% equity when you're 25 and maybe 30% equity when you're 70. So you have less risk as you get older. But target date funds are now being permitted to invest in alternatives. So I do think you will see some change there. The other point about COVID I should just touch on while we're on the topic is the withdrawals. Is it okay if I mention that?
Yes, sure.
So in the US, I mean, and Guillermo touched on this, various countries are implementing various rules to allow people to take some money out of their retirement plans. In the US, you always could take some out as a loan, but there were limits, and you had to pay taxes if you didn't pay the loan back right away or if you took too much out. The US is now allowing loans of up to $100,000 of your balance. And you know, there's tremendous risk in that. I'm not saying that if you have nothing left, if you truly have nothing left, then of course your retirement balance is a place that any one of us as fiduciaries would say, well, then of course you must go there. But you need to be at nothing left, because otherwise you risk locking in losses. Now, the marketplace recently has rebounded so much, maybe that those losses wouldn't be what they might have been if you had taken your money out on, you know, March 25th. But you risk locking in losses. You also have to pay it back. And in the US, if you lose your job, you actually have to pay it back even more quickly. And most importantly, you lose the growth. So you take the loan out, it takes 3 years to pay it back. That's 3 years of growth of the income that you would have been able to receive later that won't be growing because it won't be in the account. So I don't see 401k asset allocation changes so much. I do see DB plans focusing more on liquidity, and I am concerned about people taking those loans from their plans. Lastly, I've also heard discussion that in some European countries, those may even be guaranteed by the government. Those loans might actually be guaranteed or covered by the government, which is a very different approach to retirement, certainly than we would have in the US with 401k plan.
Yes, on the on the plan level side, we see the COVID crisis as something we need to manage through. And we learned through the global financial crisis, and we've always had a pretty good liquidity program. So we had no issues there. But the Bank of Canada also helped some of the plans that were tight on liquidity. So there was a little bit of a rescue package there in Canada. But broader, from a strategic risk management perspective, we see as much opportunity as risk as a result of the COVID crisis. Clearly, as a long-term investor, we're trying to understand what the impacts and which industries are going to go away or which are going to face headwinds, but which are going to face tailwinds as well. But our strategic risk management framework has altered a little bit, and we have really two streams. We have the economic, no recovery or slow recovery here, and then a U, a V, or a W-shaped recovery here, which, given that we have a large funding reserve, we don't have to worry about next year or the year after. At 118% funded, at the worst we got during the COVID crisis, we got down to 117, a drop of 1% in terms of our funded ratio, and our assets under management are higher today than they were at the beginning of the year. So COVID, the markets have definitely bounced a lot. So our mind turns more to deflation, stagflation, hyperinflation. What are the impacts of the loosening of the monetary supply? So those are some of the bigger things we're looking for. In terms of the individual members, as a defined benefit plan, we do not provide funding out to members, nor does our legislation really permit that to happen. I think there's some discussion happening in Canada, but instead the federal government and the provinces are actually providing cash to households in this emergency wage packages of maybe $2,000 per month going out to these households, so that need to withdraw from savings is lessened because there's funding coming from other sources. But in general, there's a little bit of a slippery slope here, where so we have 13 different regulators in Canada on the pension side. It's not consolidated federally, and some of them are relaxing the standards of what we call in Canada unlocking money, so gaining access to it instead of it being earmarked for savings. So we are monitoring what might happen on that side. And finally, there are, similar to what Charles said, there are some hardship rules. So if your monies are locked in to only be used for retirement, if you meet certain criteria, and this was pre-COVID, then you can gain access to part of those monies. So it's really dealing with a hardship type issue and proving hardship to get access to that versus a broad change that's accessible to everybody. My personal views on this are that there's a lot of talk about pensions in Canada in general, so a lot of politicians are fairly well informed, and we know that a quick withdrawal now ends up being a much bigger and more expensive problem in the future. And since Canadians aren't really willing to see poverty in their senior population, they know it'll either result in increased taxes or other types of issues. So far so good in Canada. We're able to not tap on the pension plan shoulders to release funding and keep the plans focused on that 25-year period in retirement.
I would like to apologize with the people who sent questions and we couldn't answer them because of time. I have do my best to try to cover them, but unfortunately I can't make all the questions because the amount of questions I am getting. Just to use the last minutes, I will try to pick up one or two questions more. I think this is a very important question. Maybe you talked about this before. Is one of the main risks of private pension fund system is the use of resources for other objectives instead of giving pensions, as we said about COVID. How do you address that risk in the US and Canada?
I'm happy to go first, Carlos.
Yeah, please do.
In Canada, I think it stems from the governance structure. So the governors have this fiduciary duty. Their focus is on the retirement period of members, and they're staying very close to what their mandate is. So I think having independent governance is a very strong component of the Canadian system to avoid the near term, because let's face it, there's tons of studies out there that say human DNA does not naturally think about our future self, i.e. retirement. Current consumption, current issues almost always prevail. So having mandatory, independent, protect my future self, I think is a key component of a good pension system.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this answers the question, but I do want to highlight another component of a strong pension system, and it is pooling. And that's one of the things that Derek's plan has, and the Netherlands has some of, and defined benefit plans traditionally did, but collective defined benefit plans or modern defined benefit plans can actually pool longevity risk. And when you pool longevity risk, you have so strengthened the potential for positive outcomes for retirees. The reason I mention that is I know in particular in Chile, and I saw there was one question about Chile, if Chile is in the middle of pension reform, or any country who's listening to this is in the middle of pension reform, please think about how you can pool longevity risk. There are many ways to do that, because if you don't pool longevity risk, then every individual is in an individual situation and must invest as though he or she might live to be 100. But if you pool longevity risk, then you are in an actuarial situation. And then you have to invest as though you're going to be 85, because the people who die early will subsidize the people who die late. And while individual systems can be great, they're even better if they can find a way to be pooled.
Well, I think we are on time to finish. 3 minutes more. So I want to take your last 3 minutes, and I would like to ask you if there is some advice that you can give us for improving our pension systems in Latin America.
Well, I just did, so Derek, why don't
Yes.
you go?
Sure. So I'll say that I was very upset about where the Netherlands ended up. So they dismantled a very good system, primarily due to poor communication and stakeholder engagement. So my strong advice is, what I've seen when I was looking at the Chilean system, for example, is the results were very positive on a real return basis. But the outcomes weren't being met, and there's a disconnect. So good communication, good governance, good stakeholder relations is something that we all have to invest in. So that's number one. The second thing is there's two main models in the world to simplify things. There's the investment model, this risk-shared model that Charles and I talked about. That leads to the best outcomes as long as you have good communication and good governance, versus the risk-free insurance type of approach with low discount rates and other things. This is not, from my perspective, the way to go, because as individuals, I can beat a bond index over my career. So there's no value in having a collective system. So the investment pooled risk model with good communication is the way, from my perspective, to go forward from a pension reform perspective and take advantage of pooling. It can double the outcomes, positive outcomes with less risk and less stress for the participants, which I think is our number one goal.
Thank you, Derek and Charles, once again. And I want to thank all the participants today. It was a very nice conversation, and I hope you and your families are fine, and keep talking.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Pleasure.
I think maybe Guillermo wants to just say some words for closing. It appears he does. He don't. Okay. So,
No, there he is.
Here?
yes.
Hello. Yeah. Let me speak in Spanish, please. Taking advantage that we have translation. Bueno, quiero agradecerle a Derek y a Charles por el brillante exposición que nos han hecho en un momento muy atingente en nuestros países, porque tal como lo dije en la introducción, hay acá una ola reformista que se está alejando mucho de criterios técnicos y está más bien apoyada en prejuicios de carácter más ideológicos. Desgraciadamente, esos temas no se tocaron en el caso ni de Perú ni en el caso de Chile. Simplemente se vio que las pensiones no estaban alcanzando un nivel satisfactorio, sin tomar en cuenta criterios que ustedes mencionaron, como es el de la longevidad y los bajos niveles de formalización que tiene el trabajo. Porque si uno toma el caso chileno, por ejemplo, para personas que han cotizado regularmente a lo largo de toda su vida, las pensiones van a ser buenas. Desgraciadamente lo que ocurrió es que se saca un promedio de todos los pensionados, entre los cuales hay personas que cotizaron un año. Y como estamos en un sistema de beneficio definido, en que hay una propiedad privada sobre los fondos, hay que dar igual pensión. Naturalmente, ya la pensión a una persona que ahorró un solo año no puede ser satisfactoria. De manera que creo que nos ilustra muy bien a todos los personas a cargo de las políticas públicas, nos ilustra muy bien la exposición que ustedes han hecho de cómo fortalecer y cómo desarrollar este sistema, pero por el tiempo que pasa, digamos, por este tiempo, vamos a tener que ver cómo se sortean criterios que están muy, muy apartados de criterios técnicos para llevar y fortalecer estos sistemas. Por eso creo que el aporte que ustedes nos han hecho ha sido extraordinario. Le agradezco también muy sinceramente a Carol por la forma en que llevó la moderación y estoy seguro que todos los participantes han quedado muy bien ilustrados por ustedes. Les reitero, Charles y Derek, mis agradecimientos y por mi intermedio los de toda la Federación Internacional de AFP, en que estamos básicamente somos los sistemas de pensiones de Latinoamérica, aunque tenemos socios también en Europa. Muchas gracias y hasta siempre.
Un placer.
Thank you. Bye bye.